What's the scariest thing you've ever witnessed? Story one, I went hiking with three of my friends yesterday up one of my favorite canyons here in Utah, and it is extremely close to the town, but usually no one goes there because the hike is very difficult. This time, however, on the way up the trail, we were occasionally finding things like shoes, coats, backpacks, shirts, and water bottles all lying on the ground in the middle of the trail. The first couple of times I was like, whatever, someone probably just set their stuff down and went up the hill for a bit. But then we kept going and got to a good spot to rest, and there was a big pile of stuff that looked like someone was maybe living there, with a large hiking bag, a sleeping bag, and a tent, all in a pile under a big rock. But no one was around. We hiked further up the trail and found another backpack with several coats strewn about on the ground, and the backpack was 100% full to the point of bursting, and we did not look inside because I did not want to know what was in there. By this point, I was starting to feel a little wary because it was a lot of stuff, like it would probably take 10 people to haul all of that up such a steep trail, or one person making 10 trips up, and either way it was strange. But we kept going up the trail only to find another big pile of stuff right in the middle of the path, which looked like a military-style ammunition case and several large backpacks that were completely full of something, piled on top of other bags that I could not even make out. Just a big old pile of random items. For some reason, seeing this pile set off warning signals in my brain, and as I came around a corner and stopped, seconds later it suddenly became very quiet, with all the birds stopping their chirping and all the animals going completely silent out of nowhere. My friend called out asking if anyone was there, and there was only silence. And while I could have been too paranoid because of all the strange things we had seen, I genuinely felt like there were eyes watching me from somewhere, and it seriously creeped me out. I made the decision that we were going to turn around and leave, because something strange was going on in that canyon, and I did not want to find out what it was. So I kept wondering whether people had disappeared, or if there was something dangerous out there, because it was extremely unsettling to think about who would haul all of that random stuff up a canyon trail and just leave it scattered in the middle of the path, and what the purpose of that could possibly be. I am planning to go back to investigate further at some point, but next time I will go earlier in the day and be more prepared to protect myself if needed, because I have seen some creepy, unexplained things in that canyon a couple of times before, and I honestly do not know what to make of it. Story two, I went out to eat at a Chinese restaurant with a couple of friends, and one of them has a shellfish allergy, but she always tells the staff every single time. And we had been to that restaurant countless times before without any issues. That day, however, we had a new server who barely spoke English, and apparently the message did not get passed along that she had an allergy and absolutely could not have anything that came into contact with shellfish, including food fried in the same oil as shellfish. You can probably guess where this is going, because she started eating and then suddenly began to panic and told us to call 911 because she was having an allergic reaction. I got on the phone while she took out her epinephrine auto-injector and accidentally injected it straight through her thumb. Thankfully, the emergency response time was incredibly fast, and they were able to administer epinephrine before her throat completely closed up. Aside from an expensive hospital bill and a very sore thumb, she ended up being okay, but for a few terrifying moments, when she had injured her thumb with the injection and her condition was clearly getting worse, I truly believed I might see my best friend suffocate right in front of me, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. Story three, I was sitting in a complete traffic standstill in the middle of some roadworks with the engine off and the windows open, just accepting that I was going to be there for a while, since people had already been out of their cars and spread the news that we were all stuck. I suddenly heard sirens, so naturally I switched the engine back on and pulled the car as close to the edge as possible to let the emergency vehicles through, assuming it was an ambulance responding to a crash or something similar. The next thing I knew, about 10 cars back, a car suddenly burst out from a gap between the vehicles, and three police cars came charging up the closed lane behind him. He stopped for barely a second and then floored it straight down the middle of all the stopped traffic, with wing mirrors smashing and flying everywhere. There was absolutely nothing anyone could do, and I just braced myself, convinced he was about to hit me. But thankfully, because I had already moved in, he shot past me, clipped a van, and disappeared further down the line. Luckily, no one was hurt, and there was only minor damage overall, but it took a long time for my heart rate to calm back down to normal. I never did find out what was actually going on, although later I found a photo on Facebook showing the aftermath. And not long after that, the traffic started moving again, once the police cars blocking the road went after the driver and reopened it. Story 4, I was making the long drive home from a lake house, following behind a large tractor trailer on the highway in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Canadian Rockies. As we rounded a bend, out of nowhere, a small car coming from the opposite direction at far too high a speed for the curve lost control and slammed head-on into the tractor trailer at full highway speed. A massive cloud of debris exploded into the air, and the small car spun violently off into the ditch. Instinctively, I jumped out and ran toward the wreck, yelling at another motorist to call 911. When I reached the small car, there was almost nothing left of the front end, and the engine had been thrown clear across to the other side of the highway. I looked inside what was left of the vehicle and could not find the driver, and for a moment I was completely confused until I looked around and saw him lying in the ditch nearby. I ran over and checked his carotid pulse, but there was nothing. As I stepped back, it hit me just how badly he was injured, with severe and catastrophic damage to his body that I will never be able to forget. The highway was shut down for 8 hours while the scene was investigated, and even now the image of what I saw that day has never truly faded from my mind. Story 5. I was riding in the back seat of a Volkswagen Jetta on the freeway, going about 80 miles per hour, with 2 other people in the car. A friend of a friend was driving and speeding, trying to catch up to some kind of supercar that was a little way ahead of us. Suddenly, the hood of the car popped up and completely shattered the front windshield, slammed into the metal roof section just a few inches from the top of the windshield, ripped part of the plastic roof undercarriage loose, which then flew down the freeway and stayed upright, blocking all forward visibility. We were still moving at full speed, and the driver leaned out the window and somehow managed to guide us safely over to the side of the road. A police officer had been right behind us and had not even noticed the speeding or the fact that the driver had an expired license, and he just stood there in disbelief, saying he was impressed with how the situation had been handled before calling a tow truck. It turned out the driver had recently fixed the hood locking mechanism with a clothes hanger, which failed the moment wind got underneath it. The whole thing was absolutely terrifying, and even now I still get flashbacks whenever I am going fast in a car, half expecting the hood to smash through the windshield again, especially remembering how we were all covered in glass afterward. Story 6. Everything felt like a normal day until it suddenly started raining so hard it felt like a waterfall. I usually take side streets in weather like that, but I wanted to get home as quickly as possible because work had been awful that day, and all I wanted to do was relax. As I was driving on the highway in rain so intense I could feel it pounding through the car, there were 4 vehicles ahead of me, 3 cars and a truck, and visibility was terrible, so I was driving as carefully as I could. Then the cars in front of me started slowing and stopping, and I saw movement ahead, something spinning out of control, and I realized it was the truck. I had never seen an accident happen right in front of me before, but there it was, a huge truck losing control and crashing into the guardrail. Everyone stopped, and I signaled to move toward the nearest exit, thinking the truck was stuck in the lane I had been in. That was not the case because the people inside the truck ran out without putting it in park and just let it roll. The truck slowly drifted into the lane I had just moved into, directly toward a woman and a man who were holding their child. I saw the impact in front of the truck, and my stomach dropped when I realized there was a child involved, and all I could do was hope they were okay. I just wanted to get home and hug my wife, and after exiting the highway I decided I would never take it again on days with rain like that. And I still genuinely hope that family made it through safely. Story 7. I have a couple of stories, and the worst one happened while I was driving to work at a job I absolutely hated at a shoe store. I was zoned out while driving when I noticed out of the corner of my eye a car suddenly lose control out of nowhere. In one moment the driver was fine, and the next his car rolled 4 or 5 times off to the right side of the highway and completely off the road. I managed to pull over, call 911, and run to check on him, and I found that he had been thrown from the vehicle and had suffered severe injuries, and he was unconscious, not breathing, and I could not feel a pulse. I started chest compressions while waiting for emergency services to arrive, and when they took over a few minutes later, they were unable to get him breathing on his own. They eventually transported him away, and after giving a statement to the police, I went on to work, only for it to fully sink in later that day that I had watched someone die and had been performing compressions on a body that was already gone, an image that stayed with me for a very long time. The second occasion was when I lived in Mexico City and attended a religious school for a few months to learn Spanish, since I am from the United States. And one day it rained so heavily within a single hour that the streets turned into rivers and the floors inside the buildings were covered with a thin layer of water. The linoleum floors became incredibly slippery, and everyone was sliding around when someone jokingly shouted for a trick. And a friend of mine, who was always willing to do something reckless, ran, slid, and only made it halfway through the move before his feet flew out from under him and his face hit the floor in an instant. I watched several of his teeth break on impact and disappear across the floor, while others chipped, and blood immediately poured from his mouth and nose, spreading across a large section of the hallway. I grabbed paper towels and pressed them to his face as he struggled to stand, soaking them almost instantly, while others tried to clean the area, and he ended up with a badly broken nose, multiple missing teeth, and several more damaged, yet somehow handled it all with incredible toughness. Story 8. A few years ago, during the very early morning hours of July 5th, I woke up needing to use the bathroom, and as I walked back to bed, I passed my husband in the hallway, heading to his own bathroom, when we suddenly heard and felt an extremely loud, concussive explosion that was so intense it was physically uncomfortable, and felt like the pressure made my heart skip a beat. As adults living in a post-September 11th world, we were immediately alarmed, and I even said out loud that it sounded like a bomb, while car alarms throughout the neighborhood began going off nonstop. It was warm, and we had our windows and sliding glass door open, and that was when I heard a man nearby screaming for someone to call 911, and he was very close. It turned out that someone in our apartment complex had been extremely intoxicated on the 4th of July and had duct taped a bundle of sparklers together before placing it in the middle of the street and lighting it, not realizing how quickly it would ignite. The blast sent metal fragments everywhere, embedding them into parked cars and trees dozens of feet away, and the street itself was left with a dark blast mark right along the center line. The person responsible suffered catastrophic injuries, including the loss of his lower leg and severe damage to his arm, and he briefly went into cardiac arrest in the ambulance before being revived. I never found out whether charges were filed, but the apartment manager later confirmed that he permanently lost his lower leg and nearly lost his arm as well. Story 9. I worked at a boat and jet ski rental business during one summer, and toward the end of the season, things had slowed down so much that we only had 2 or 3 rentals a day, making most days very quiet and uneventful. One afternoon, a group of young men in their early 20s rented 3 jet skis for an hour, and it was fairly routine aside from repeatedly telling them to keep distance between the skis and slow down near the shore and docks. During the last 10 minutes of their rental, I was on my phone and could hear the engines in the background, when suddenly the sound stopped completely, and I looked up and immediately shouted for my coworker to call our boss as I jumped on a spare jet ski and rushed out. 2 of the skis had collided at full speed, tearing one of them nearly in half, and I saw one rider with severe facial injuries and blood everywhere, while the others were struggling in the water nearby. I pulled the injured man onto my jet ski and yelled for my coworker to call 911, and it later turned out that he had suffered extensive facial fractures and lost nearly all of his teeth, while another rider had broken his leg in multiple places and sustained a serious foot injury. We got them back to the dock where emergency responders arrived, and I spent the next 3 hours pulling the destroyed jet skis from the water and cleaning up large amounts of blood, an experience I will never forget. Story 10. I was in my apartment on a nice summer day, and my street is full of bars, so there were the usual crowds along with a lot of tourists, making it feel like just another typical summer afternoon. All of a sudden, I heard screeching tires followed by a loud crash, and I assumed it was just another vehicle hitting a parked car, since it is a one-way street that can feel like it has two lanes depending on how cars are parked. I was very wrong. When I looked out my window, the first thing I saw was a single red shoe lying in the middle of the road. A woman was running toward a man who was lying on the side of the street next to a van, and I can still remember her screaming the words, "Oh God," over and over again. I ran downstairs while calling 911, and when I got outside, I saw the motorcycle, which had slid underneath a truck on the right side of the road, while the rider had been thrown to the left. The sounds were unsettling, with the injured man moaning in pain, the woman trying to talk to him, and paramedics arriving shortly after. Based on how the bike had ended up, he was incredibly lucky to have been thrown clear, and although he was in serious pain, the fact that he had been wearing a helmet likely saved his life. I had lived in that apartment for almost 2 years, and this was the first major accident that had ever happened there. I tried later to find out if the man was okay, but he ended up being just another anonymous statistic, and I still like to believe that he recovered and is doing well with his life now. Story 11, I grew up in a very small rural community, the kind where the entire county only had one stoplight, and most of the streets in the county seat were one way, and everyone knew everyone else and all of their business. On the day this happened, the high school and middle school students were already on the bus, and since I was in middle school at the time, we were slowly circling the one-way streets toward the funnel that led to the county's only stoplight so we could eventually reach the elementary school. As we crept forward and stopped at the end of a small cross street that happened to have the only three bars in town, I looked out the window to my left just in time to see the father of one of my classmates shoot a man at extremely close range with a double-barreled shotgun. The man was standing on the sidewalk against the white wall of a small restaurant across from the bars, and my classmate's father was standing only a few feet away on the curb. The violence of it was immediate and horrifying, and I will never forget the sight left behind against that white wall on what had otherwise been a beautiful fall afternoon. After firing the shot, the man calmly turned, sat down on the curb with the weapon beside him, lit a cigarette, and waited for the police to arrive. I was the only person on the bus who actually saw him pull the trigger, because everyone else turned only after hearing the blast. The bus driver radioed it in, but could not move the bus because of the bottleneck created by the stoplight and the one-way streets. So a bus full of about 20 middle and high school students was forced to sit there for nearly 15 minutes, staring at the aftermath, until emergency crews finally made it through traffic and our bus was able to pull away. Story 12. There was a person in a packed restaurant who was talking to themselves, pounding on the table, singing and screaming, while the staff seemed to completely ignore what was happening and act as if everything was normal. Because of that, I assumed the person was likely dealing with some kind of mental health issue, but was still functioning well enough that the situation was not immediately dangerous. At some point, the person went into the bathroom and stayed there for well over half an hour, and people kept casually checking and assuming everything was fine simply because the lights were still on. Eventually, I felt compelled to tell a staff member that they probably needed to call an ambulance, because there was a real chance the person inside was unconscious. The look of horror on the staff member's face said everything, because it turned out that despite all the so-called checking, not a single person had actually knocked on the door or confirmed that the person was even responsive. I left shortly after they finally began to take the situation seriously and call for help. I have never gone back to that place because, while it is obviously frightening for staff to handle something like that, I am convinced they would have continued hesitating and doing nothing if I had not spoken up. And I genuinely hope the person survived, even though I am not very confident that they did. Story 13, I went out fishing less than 1 month ago and had been out on the water all morning when we saw three large speedboats flying down the river at full speed, clearly out for a fun run. We decided to head out and follow them, because who does not enjoy watching something like that? When suddenly we saw the lead boat lose control, and the two behind it immediately cut power and stopped. The front speedboat completely lost control and threw everyone from the boat, and there were no life jackets and no kill switches in use. When we pulled up, another boat, a random guy on a pontoon, had already arrived and was trying to help the people who had been thrown into the water, but the out-of-control speedboat was still driving in tight circles around the passengers. The driver of the pontoon boat had been struck by the propeller and lost his leg, and a friend of mine who was right there managed to pull him from the water and get him to shore, where he was placed in an ambulance quickly and his life was saved. The driver of the speedboat survived, but his father, who had been a passenger, was missing. We searched for hours using everything we had, including side imaging fish finders, and the sight of a man standing on a boat screaming and crying uncontrollably for his father is something I never want to witness again. Later that evening, dive crews recovered the body of his father, and since that day I have been afraid to go out on a boat. The son who had been driving had bought the boat only 3 days earlier, and investigators later said a malfunction caused it to lose control. And while safety gear like life jackets and kill switches could have helped, it was still the kind of accident that could happen to anyone. It was a harsh reminder that wearing life jackets and taking safety seriously on the water matters, because even if they do not look cool, they can truly make the difference between life and death. Story 14. When I was about 8 years old, I was standing in our living room admiring a beautiful sunset through the window. And since I lived in South Florida, the sky was filled with intense yellows, oranges, and purples. That same window overlooked the main road in front of our house. And as I snapped back to reality, I saw what I first thought was a white trash bag being thrown about 10 feet into the air. But a second later, I realized it was actually a woman riding a bicycle. I screamed for help, and I remember my aunt and my mother running outside to help since my mother was a registered nurse, while I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. The next thing I knew, my aunt was running back toward me, yelling for me to call 911. But I could not bring myself to do anything except stand there. The woman who had been hit turned out to be my gym teacher, and she had been riding her bike with headphones on when an elderly woman, who was having trouble with her brakes, took a back road and struck her. The gym teacher's son was in my class, and although I never told him that I witnessed what happened, it clearly affected him deeply for years, even though he later became very successful, and I often think about how different his childhood must have been from mine. About 5 years later, I was walking along a campground road with my father, who managed the property, and we were heading to check on a bathroom that was having issues, while a main road ran parallel to the path about 300 feet away. I saw a group of kids riding inside an inflatable boat that was being pulled on the back of a truck at highway speed, while the truck was also towing a real boat, and the kids were laughing loudly as they went. Suddenly, wind caught underneath the inflatable boat and lifted it into the air, launching the kids onto the road, with some flying over the boat being towed and others being struck by it. I never found out what happened to those kids because my father kept me away from the scene. But I still remember the conversation we were having right before it happened, as clearly as if it were yesterday, even though it has been almost 20 years since then. Story 15. I used to work at a movie theater, and this happened a little over 2 years ago, when one afternoon around noon, a movie ended and the audience left, and one of my coworkers was sent in to clean the theater. A few minutes later, she came running back around the corner, screaming and crying uncontrollably, and when we asked what happened, she explained that when she entered the theater, which was completely silent with no movie playing, she heard a loud, constant noise that sounded almost like an industrial vacuum. As she walked toward the hidden light switch on the wall, she said the noise kept getting louder with every step, becoming overwhelming by the time she reached it, and the moment she flipped the switch, the sound abruptly stopped, leaving a heavy, disturbing silence that filled her with dread, causing her to drop everything and run out. I volunteered to check it out, went into the theater, cleaned it for her, and stayed behind for a few minutes out of curiosity, asking aloud if anyone was there, and if something could show a sign of its presence, then took several photos of the room before telling whatever might be there that it was not welcome. Afterward, I told my coworker it was probably the air conditioning system acting up, even though I knew that explanation did not make much sense. And later I started going through the photos I had taken. One image looked like a vague face among the seats, which I could dismiss as lighting, but another was much harder to explain, showing what appeared to be a second figure standing behind me, reflected in the small window of the theater entrance hallway. My manager and I debated whether to tell my coworker and instead decided to investigate further, checking multiple theaters, asking questions, and taking photos. but finding nothing until we entered one theater where previews were already playing and used a night vision camera instead of turning on the lights. While inside, we both noticed a brief flash from the projector booth and assumed it was normal. But when I zoomed in with the camera, I saw what looked like an arm hanging upside down and slowly swinging back and forth above the booth window, as if someone was hidden there. I froze in absolute terror and could not even speak. And when my manager asked what I saw, all I could say was that we needed to leave immediately. Later, I realized I had been too afraid to take a photo, and for the rest of that day, we stopped cleaning theaters altogether. And for weeks afterward, no one would enter those rooms alone. There had been other unsettling moments there, like hearing a loud impact against the front wall while cleaning when no one else was inside, or tripping over a seat that had suddenly flipped down behind me as if something had moved it. And although I stopped working there during my final year of high school, those memories are still as vivid to me now as they were back then. Story 16, I was robbed at gunpoint while working at a pizza place when I was about 21 years old, many years ago, and the man who came in looked completely normal and gave off no bad vibes at all. I was in the lobby cleaning while the assistant manager I was training took his order, and I was casually chatting with the guy while his food was being made. When the order was ready, my coworker told him the total was $2.07. The man handed over a $10 bill, and when the cash drawer opened, he suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed straight at me. He asked if I knew what it was, and I remember being so shocked that my mind reacted strangely until the fear finally hit all at once. He grabbed me, pressed the gun to my head, and forced me behind the counter, where I opened the register and emptied it for him. He then demanded I open the safe, and I explained that part of it could be opened immediately, but the larger deposit section had a time delay and would take 15 minutes. So he made me open the accessible part. After that, he forced me, my coworker, and our delivery driver to lie face down on the floor with our hands behind our heads and our eyes closed. And I truly believed we were about to be killed because we had seen his face clearly for a long time. In that moment, my entire life flashed through my mind in a way that is impossible to describe, with memories and moments all appearing at once, including a vivid image of my young daughter as she was back then, which still gives me chills even now. The man eventually left without physically harming us, but the way the company handled it afterward was devastating, as they accused me of endangering future employees for opening the safe and wanted to fire me, only backing down after my supervisor threatened to quit and instead suspending me for 2 weeks. As soon as I was able to find another job, I left that place and never looked back. Story 17, I was working my regular job as a bank teller when two men wearing ski masks suddenly came in, one of them jumping over the teller counter into the drive-through area, while the other climbed onto the counter itself and marched back and forth, shouting orders. Every employee except me and one other woman hid, and I stood frozen until the man fired 2 shots in my direction, missing both times. I immediately began gathering as much money as I could and stuffing it into his bag. And when he demanded more, I moved toward another station and saw one employee trying to crawl toward the phone, clearly trying to be a hero. I had to fight the urge to react because the robber could see her too, so I focused on handing over more money until the men finally ran out. The police arrived quickly because hidden employees had pressed the emergency button, and we had to coax several people out of bathrooms where they were hiding. Federal investigators came later, and the men were eventually caught a few months afterward, with trials that dragged on for more than a year. Even now, I wonder whether hiding would have been safer or if it would have made things worse, since someone needed to give them the money, and the other employee who stayed visible was shaking so badly she could barely move. That experience taught me a hard lesson about fear, instinct, and the reality of working in a bank. Story 18. It was a completely normal day when my twin sister and I, both 13 years old at the time, were walking to school, arguing like usual, buying sodas, and taking a slightly different route than we normally did without thinking much of it. As we crossed one street and stopped at a set of crossroads to cross again, a large van pulled up on our left side and blocked our view, and the driver began making strange hand gestures while waiting. After standing there for a moment, I asked my sister if she thought he was signaling for us to cross, and in her impulsive way, she assumed he was and ran forward. I stayed where I was, thinking to myself that one day her recklessness would get her hurt, and in the next instant, I watched her get hit and thrown through the air like a rag doll. I stood there in shock, unable to move, trying to process whether what I was seeing was real as she struggled to roll over and sit up with blood coming from her nose. A police officer who happened to be just a street away saw everything and rushed to help, and she was taken to the hospital, where it turned out she had a broken rib and a badly swollen leg, but survived with no permanent damage. Even now, years later, I still feel sick when riding in a car, and I will never forget the moment I watched her get hit and the overwhelming thought that I should have stopped her. Story 19, I was visiting New York City with a friend, and we were trying to rent bikes, but all of them were gone. A couple nearby mentioned they were flying back to Europe the next day and really wanted to go on a bike ride, but they only had access to one bike. So I offered them the one I was about to rent, and they were genuinely thrilled, with the excitement on their faces completely making my day. My friend and I then walked to another bike rack about a quarter of a mile away and managed to rent two bikes of our own. And as we were riding down the path a short while later, we heard sirens and saw a large crowd gathered near a garbage truck about 10 feet away. We learned that the brakes on one of the rental bikes had failed and that a rider had been struck by the truck, and there was a long trail of blood on the ground while the injured person was having severe convulsions. As we got closer, I recognized the man screaming in distress as the same person from earlier, and the injured person on the ground was his wife. The same couple we had been so happy to help had their lives changed forever in a single moment, and the scene made it painfully clear that she was not going to survive. That moment stayed with me for a long time, because the bike with the faulty brakes had been the one I originally intended to ride, and what felt like a simple act of kindness ended up having devastating consequences, leaving me constantly wondering what would have happened if I had never given that bike away. Story 20. I have a few experiences that still unsettle me, starting with a backcountry camping trip at Big Bend near the Rio Grande, where my husband and I followed all the safety instructions, hiking a full mile from the road and making sure we were far from cliffs and streams. After sunset, we zipped up the tent, and once everything went quiet, we suddenly heard loud, heavy panting right next to us, which stopped as abruptly as it began, without any sound of footsteps, and I did not sleep at all that night. On two separate occasions, my family and I were driving through rural West Texas at night at around 60 miles per hour when large animals suddenly ran out in front of our vehicle, once clearly a massive boar and another time an enormous tan blur that we could not identify, coming so close that my heart raced for minutes afterward, and I still cannot stop thinking about what it might have been. The last incident was different but still disturbing, when my children and I were walking across a university campus and encountered a very tall young man having a seizure, already on the ground with his head repeatedly striking the pavement. I asked another passerby what could be done, and we placed a backpack under his head and tried to help until an ambulance arrived. But his color had turned gray, and to this day I do not know if he survived. Story 21. I was in the parking lot of a community college when I heard intense shouting coming from multiple people. And when I followed the noise, I saw a Polynesian man yelling at three large men who were walking toward a white pickup truck displaying a Confederate flag, with the argument continuing from about 20 yards away. Without warning, all three men calmly reached into the bed of the truck, pulled out chainsaws, started them, revved the engines, scraped the blades against the asphalt, and began walking in a straight line toward him in a scene that felt unreal. The Polynesian man was not particularly tall or large compared to them, but instead of backing down, he tore off his shirt, revealing extensive traditional tattoos, and began performing what appeared to be a haka, staring them down alone with a level of intensity that still gives me chills. For about 30 seconds, I genuinely believed I was about to witness a horrific act of violence, but the three men suddenly backed off, shut off the chainsaws, and drove away, clearly unwilling to follow through. I have never forgotten that moment, because the calm strength and fearlessness that man displayed was unlike anything I have ever seen. Story 22. When I was about 9 years old, I lived in an equatorial country, and on sunny afternoons, I would take two buckets and walk to the local well to fetch water for our house, trips that often turned into informal gatherings for neighborhood children. The well was located beside a paved road, and we would stand in line chatting along the edge while waiting our turn. One day, as I stood there waiting to fill my buckets, a man riding a 10-speed racing bicycle came around a sharp turn at the nearby intersection at a very high speed, then suddenly slammed on his brakes and came to a hard stop, the noise of the chain rattling loudly against the frame drawing everyone's attention. He did not cry out or say a word, but stood completely still, straddling the bicycle and staring down at the ground, where a small but very noticeable pool of red began forming near his foot. It was not large, but it was unmistakable. We soon realized that because he had been riding barefoot, his left big toe had struck the pavement during the turn and had been severely torn at the joint. We moved closer without speaking, frozen by how quiet and unreal the scene felt. A group of children staring as the man balanced on his bike, his injured toe hanging to the side, barely attached. An adult eventually came out from a nearby house, and at some point water was poured over the injury at the man's request, and he calmly asked for a cigarette. The details after that are blurry, but the image of his shaking hand as he smoked while bleeding has stayed with me clearly, even into adulthood. Story 23. This happened in rural India while I was traveling by car with my mother and father after visiting relatives, following closely behind a large lorry as we passed through a small town. Suddenly, the lorry came to an abrupt stop, and I saw a moped thrown violently to the side of the road. My father and I got out of the car and ran forward, where we found an older man, likely in his mid-50s, lying on the ground with a severe head injury that was immediately visible, with significant bleeding. I could not tell how serious the injury truly was, but there was an overwhelming amount of blood, and it was terrifying to witness. The most disturbing part was that everyone around us simply stood there frozen, including me, because I had never seen anything like that before, and my heart was pounding uncontrollably. Eventually, my father began shouting for cloth, and another man removed his shirt so it could be tied around the injured man's head to slow the bleeding. The man was breathing heavily and appeared to be struggling, and someone ran off to find a taxi to take him to the nearest hospital, since ambulances can take a long time to reach rural areas. We later learned that he had not been wearing a helmet or any protective gear, which is sadly common in many parts of India, where helmets are often only worn in cities to avoid police fines. He had tried to turn off the main road into a side street and misjudged the distance, colliding directly with the lorry. The accident happened less than 10 kilometers from my home, and the memory still stays with me, along with the reminder that wearing proper safety gear can truly save lives. Story 24. There is a loop road around our town that functions like a highway in some sections, and a busy surface road with traffic lights in others. And right at the transition point, people tend to speed up. There are no sidewalks or lights in this area, but occasionally someone will try to cross what is essentially a highway on foot. Late one night, a car full of college students was accelerating through that transition when a young girl wearing dark clothing tried to cross the road. With no streetlights or signals, she was almost completely invisible. She was attempting to cross 4 lanes of traffic with a speed limit of 60 miles per hour, including on ramps and off ramps, even though there was a crosswalk with a light about 500 yards away. The car hit her. She looked to be around 12 years old and she was not moving. The college student spilled out of the car in shock. Her sister was crying and screaming, and a few of the students tried to stop traffic so she would not be hit again, while the driver stood frozen by the door, staring in disbelief. Everyone involved was a child, and it was absolutely horrifying. I pulled my car across the road to block traffic along with a few other drivers, aimed my headlights toward the scene, and called the police. I will never forget the sound of the younger sister screaming at the 18-year-old driver that he had killed her sister, or the look of pure terror on his face as tears streamed down. Story 25. This is a story I had completely forgotten about until fairly recently, and I usually tell it when people ask me what England is like in terms of violence. I was on a busy high street in Liverpool in a small gift shop on a Saturday around lunchtime, and I was about 11 years old at the time. I was minding my own business when I heard shouting outside, where 3 young men were arguing with another young man and his girlfriend right in front of the shop. Suddenly, the 3 of them grabbed him and smashed him into the shop window, not throwing him fully through, but slamming him against the glass repeatedly. This was in the early 1990s before safety glass was common, and I can still vividly picture his face draining of color as he became covered in blood, frozen in shock like a startled animal. The three attackers ran off and his girlfriend dragged him away, and to this day I do not know whether he lived or died, because the injuries looked absolutely horrific. I had completely buried that memory until a few months ago, and it makes me wonder whether violence becomes so normalized in some places that you forget how deeply abnormal it really is. Story 26. This happened on what started as a pretty casual weekend day for my friends and me a couple of years ago, when we were experimenting with a hallucinogenic substance and spending time together, laughing and talking. I was in the middle of a conversation with one friend when another close friend suddenly walked in and started talking nonstop, saying completely random things. At first we laughed it off because it seemed harmless, but he would not stop, and when I jokingly asked him to quiet down, he could not. Almost immediately the mood shifted, and I felt something was deeply wrong. I asked him calmly if he could stop talking for a moment, but he looked straight through me and continued. And that was when we realized something was seriously off. We sat him down and spent hours trying to ground him and bring him back, but nothing worked. And as the night went on, we became genuinely afraid that he might be stuck like that forever. He talked continuously through the night, would not drink water, and his lips began to crack, until eventually he said my name, and I snapped my attention to him. It took nearly half an hour for him to fully regain his awareness, and he later explained that he had been trapped in what he described as a mental loop that he could not escape. After that night, none of us ever looked at that substance the same way again, because while it can amplify positive feelings, it can just as easily intensify fear and darkness in a way that is truly unsettling. Story 27. This happened many years ago, around 35 years back, but the event itself is burned into my memory, and I know I will never forget it. I was about 8 years old at the time, back when kids could ride their bikes at night without much fear, and my brother-in-law was a mechanic who owned his own workshop, so after school I would often go there to hang around, clean tools, and help out where I could. The workshop was located in a long shed divided into separate businesses by floor-to-ceiling walls, with cabinet makers, laundries, and other shops all lined up. And the whole property sat on a stretch of road roughly halfway between a set of traffic lights and a cross intersection, separated by about 300 feet. One afternoon after school, as the businesses were closing, the workers from several shops gathered in my brother-in-law's workshop to have a few drinks and chat about the day. While we were standing around talking, we suddenly heard a motorcycle accelerating hard from the traffic lights, the unmistakable sound of full throttle gear changes, and a few of the adults laughed and jokingly said the word bang out loud as if the bike had hit something. Only for a split second later, a real crash echoed down the road. Everyone ran toward the main street, and we saw that a car at the cross intersection had been struck by the motorcycle. The bike and rider were lodged deep into the side of the car in a way that did not immediately make sense. And then we realized the helmet was not there. The helmet was further down the road, separated from the crash site, and the sight of it made it clear just how violent the impact had been. I remember starting toward it before my brother-in-law grabbed me and pulled me back to the workshop. And after he went to help, I later watched emergency crews arrive and carefully remove what was left of the wreckage. From what people later said, the motorcyclist had been traveling at an extremely high speed, close to 150 kilometers per hour, and the force of the impact with the car caused fatal injuries instantly, leaving a scene that has stayed with me ever since. Story 28, I am very late sharing this, but one of the most terrifying experiences of my life was being woken up in my bed by the fire brigade, smashing through what was left of the front and only door of my second-floor apartment, fully suited up and expecting to recover my body. It was the middle of winter on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, with nighttime temperatures around 3 or 4 degrees, and I had come home from school at 18 years old while my younger brother, who was 16, was staying at his girlfriend's place. I cooked dinner, planned to watch some television, and then suddenly fell into an unusually deep sleep, the kind where your body feels completely drained. I woke up briefly around 8 in the evening, opened my balcony door for no clear reason, went back to bed, opened my bedroom window again for no reason despite the cold, then closed my bedroom door even though no one else was home, and fell back asleep. The next thing I knew, firefighters were breaking in and pulling me from my bed, and I could not see down the hallway because it was filled with smoke, and I genuinely thought another apartment must be on fire until I reached the front and realized it was my own home. It took them about 30 minutes to clear the smoke from the two-bedroom unit, and everything inside was destroyed. Outside, paramedics tried to put me on a stretcher, but after checking my condition, they were shocked that I was alive. Police and firefighters explained that my front door had been deliberately firebombed, and because it was the only exit, the incident was classified as attempted murder. Investigators later told me I should not have survived the smoke and burning materials, but the open doors and windows had bought me just enough time, making the entire experience feel unreal, even long after it was over. Story 29. About 10 years ago, I was working in downtown Minneapolis, and one evening around quitting time, I was standing on the sidewalk having a cigarette while two city buses were parked at the curb in the bus-only lane, which was normal. What was not normal was that one of the buses was extremely loud, like the driver was revving the engine for no clear reason. As I stood there, I noticed an orange glow appearing underneath the back of the buses, so I started waving my arms at the driver to get his attention and stepped off the curb to look on the other side. That was when I realized what was happening, because a man driving a sport utility vehicle had apparently suffered a medical episode, lost control, and sideswiped the bus, leaving his vehicle pressed against it. He was unconscious behind the wheel with his foot pinning the accelerator down, and the engine had started to catch fire. The bus drivers had already reported the accident and were waiting for emergency services. And once they moved their buses out of the way, myself and two other people ran to the vehicle, unbuckled the man, and dragged him up onto the curb. I stayed until the first police officer arrived and then went back inside. And in the weeks that followed, I asked around to see how it ended. But no one ever seemed to know, and I still hope that he recovered. Story 30. The first incident happened when I was filling up my car at a gas station, and I suddenly heard a horrible crunching sound and looked up to see a serious car accident in the street not even 20 feet away. I put the fuel pump back and ran over, and two people got out of one of the cars shaken but saying they were not hurt, while no one exited the other vehicle. I went to check and found the driver, a teenage girl, panicking and hyperventilating, completely unresponsive to anything I said. The passenger side window was open, so I reached in, shut off the engine, and ran inside the station to make sure emergency services had been called. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured, but the sound of two cars colliding like that stayed with me for a long time. The second incident happened at a local bar while I was having a few drinks with an acquaintance and waiting for my turn at the pool table, when an argument broke out nearby that escalated almost instantly from shouting to shoving and then into a full brawl involving several men. I flipped over a table and crouched behind it as glasses shattered against the walls. Pool cues broke, and the chaos moved through the bar, and I stayed curled up until things quieted down enough for my friend and me to get out of there as fast as possible. Story 31. My family had a place along the Colorado River where people would often sit above the boat dock and watch others come and go. And one day we had just returned from being out on the water and were loading our boat back onto the trailer when we suddenly heard a jet ski rev to full throttle, followed by a scream and a massive crash. A man nearby had been preparing to take his daughter out on the river for her first ride, and while he was pulling his vehicle back up the ramp, his daughter was waiting on the jet ski in the water. She accidentally pulled the throttle and slammed at full speed into the concrete side of the boat ramp, flying several feet through the air and hitting the wall face first. She had braces which caused devastating injuries to her mouth, and by the time we reached her, she had already lost several teeth and was badly injured. My sister, who was a nurse, ran over immediately to help, while most of us stood frozen for a moment, including the onlookers above. The most heartbreaking part was watching the father walk back excitedly from parking his car, thinking he was about to take his 9-year-old daughter out on the river, only to see her injured and barely recognizable. She ultimately recovered, with doctors able to repair much of the damage and later provide a retainer with replacement teeth, but it was a scene I will never forget. Story 32. This happened in downtown Seattle, not far from Pike Street Market, on a casual weekday in the early afternoon. I had just crossed an intersection when a few seconds later, I heard the screech of brakes and turned around to see one of those massive car transport trucks, fully loaded with new vehicles, coming downhill far too fast. One car was still stuck in the intersection. I can only describe what happened next the way it feels in a cartoon, where for a split second parts stay in place while the rest disappears. That car did exactly that. For a brief moment, the bumper and grille seemed to remain where they were, while the center of the car was completely crushed and destroyed as the truck drove straight through it. It did not feel like a collision so much as the truck simply passing through something that offered no resistance at all, as if the car were made of thin foil. I can still remember the sound of the long chrome bumper, the kind you rarely see anymore, dropping afterward and clanging against the pavement once the truck had already continued down the road. In moments like that, you instinctively hope the person inside might somehow be okay, but there was no hope here. I saw the driver in the seat in what felt like the final instant, and then the car, as a recognizable object, simply ceased to exist. Story 33. I was in 8th grade taking a standardized test when we suddenly heard a loud crash coming from down the hallway. My teacher was not allowed to leave the classroom, but since I was the first one to finish, I was asked to go see what had happened. Everyone involved was apparently told not to talk about it afterward, but from what I pieced together, a student became angry at something a teacher said and swung at her, and when she ducked, his arm went straight through the glass window in the classroom door. The glass shattered everywhere, sliced into his arm, and hit a major blood vessel, and blood covered the floor, the walls, and even other students. When I reached the doorway, I saw the shattered window and looked inside to see the student on his knees holding his arm, while the other kids stood frozen in shock. I walked over to the 8th grade principal, shaking uncontrollably, and when she asked what was wrong, all I could say was that I could not do it. She walked back with me, took one look inside, pulled out her phone, and told me to return to class. When I got back, my teacher asked what happened, but I was crying so hard that he simply told me to lie down in the back of the room. Everyone who had been involved was excused from the rest of the test and given passing grades because of what we witnessed, and it is something I know I will never forget. Story 34. I was in 6th grade, about 11 years old, spending a normal day at the pool with my dad, my younger siblings, my dad's friend, and his daughters, all of us enjoying the sun and water. I was the oldest child there, and my dad was standing in the deep end, waiting to catch my younger sister as she jumped from the diving board. Suddenly, I noticed his head turning sharply to the right, then snapping back forward, then to the right again, over and over, like his neck was stuck in a loop. He swam to the edge of the pool, told me he thought he was about to have a seizure, and reached out his arm. I barely managed to grab him before his body went rigid, and he started seizing. I was small, not even 100 pounds, holding on to my dad, who weighed well over 200 pounds and was completely dead weight in the water. His friend was frozen in shock, so I yelled at him to help me, and together we dragged my dad along the edge to the shallow end and pulled him out onto the ground. By the time we laid him down, the seizure had stopped. I ran inside and called my mom, who rushed home immediately, and after that day my dad's friend quietly disappeared from our lives. I will never forget that moment because I truly believe that if I had not been there, my dad would have drowned. Story 35. This happened back when I was working at a fast food restaurant, and I was about 19 years old, having only been there a few months before reaching that stage where I felt I did not get paid enough to care, especially since customer service drained me mentally. One day a man walked in, waited in line like normal, and nothing seemed off until he reached the counter and pulled out what looked like a gun. After a brief moment of panic, I realized it was a very small gun that looked realistic but seemed like a joke, and my concern faded quickly. The man demanded that I give him a burger, but he did not seem desperate or aggressive at all, more like he was treating the situation as a joke. I did not play along and instead asked him what kind of burger he wanted so I could ring it up properly. It became clear that something was not right, so I told him that if he was not going to order anything, he would need to step aside so I could help the next customer. And all of this was happening in front of other people who also did not seem concerned. Eventually, the man realized no one was reacting the way he expected and left the restaurant, making the whole thing feel strange but harmless at the time. Other customers even complimented me for staying calm, and we went on with the day until the police arrived. One customer had called them, and it turned out the same man had tried the same thing at another place nearby. After the police left, my manager wrote me up for not following proper procedure and sent me home, which annoyed me at first, but later I understood why. The gun had actually been real, something the police confirmed afterward, meaning I had unknowingly put myself in serious danger, and it was a lesson I never forgot about taking situations like that seriously. Story 36. This happened to my mother about 6 years ago while she was working night shifts as a flagger for construction on a freeway near where we lived, and she witnessed a semi-truck crash that deeply shook her. She said the night had been slow like usual until her radio suddenly came to life with warnings about incoming traffic, then went completely silent. She looked over at her partner to see what was happening, just as a semi-truck flew silently over the barrier and passed directly over her before crashing on the other side. Later, it was determined that the driver had likely fallen asleep and accelerated straight into a barrier, which fortunately launched the truck over her instead of into her. I remember her coming home around 2 in the morning, waking me up just to tell me what had happened and to say that she loved me. What unsettled her the most was that the entire thing was completely silent until the moment the truck hit the ground. Nothing like what you see in movies. She sat there shaking while smoking a cigarette and said it was nothing like people imagine. And this was coming from a woman who was barely 5 feet tall, had beaten cancer twice, and trained large horses for fun. Even now, she refuses to talk about it, and it is one of the main reasons she avoids driving on the freeway. Story 37. This happened many years ago, back in 1979, when I was walking home with some friends, and we passed by an old people's home where one of the small flats was on fire, with flames visible through the low windows. We ran over and smashed the glass door, and the dog ran out first, followed by the cat, and I stayed low and crawled inside shouting because I could hear a soft voice calling for help. As I moved into the next room, the kitchen was completely engulfed, with thick smoke and fire surrounding the work surfaces, and on the floor was a large woman holding one arm up, already on fire, reaching toward me. I could not get close because the heat was unbearable, and my friends who had followed me inside dragged me back out. It took me years to even begin to process what I saw. Outside, we grabbed a garden hose and tried to fight the fire until the fire brigade arrived and took over. My friends and I stood there in total silence while these big firefighters came over and sat with us, putting their arms around our shoulders without saying a single word, just staying with us for what felt like hours. We never talked about it afterward, not once, and when the council tried to give us awards, we all refused because we just wanted to forget it. Looking back now, I realize those firefighters saw things like that all the time, yet they still took the time to sit with a group of shaken kids, probably thinking of their own children, and I have carried a deep respect for them ever since. Story 38. I was driving home late at night on the highway when the car in front of me blew a rear tire and instantly lost control while we were both traveling at about 70 miles per hour. It slammed into a semi-truck in the right lane just ahead of the rear trailer wheels and disappeared underneath for a brief moment before shooting left across the highway directly in front of my car. I narrowly missed it as it smashed into the left barricade and came to rest against the steel guardrail, facing into oncoming traffic. Another truck driver and I pulled over on the right shoulder and ran across the highway to check on the woman driving, not even knowing if she was alive. She was in shock and would not get out. The engine was still running, the car was smoking, and there were no lights because the front end had been completely destroyed. We could not get her out on the driver's side because the door would have opened straight into the fast lane, with cars flying past. And she could not understand that I was trying to get her out through the passenger side. I had her turn the engine off while the other man called 911, and we were standing just inches from traffic in the dark, with every window blown out and the wrecked car pressed against the guardrail. As I tried to wave traffic away with the light from my phone, I suddenly saw a car coming toward me at full speed, easily 80 miles per hour, and I realized the driver did not see me at all.